Well, good morning, everyone. Let me add my welcome to Stephanie's. I'm Janet B. I've recovered from compulsive eating and bulimia. Really happy to be here with all of you on this Thursday morning. We've talked before, in fact, just a couple weeks ago on Monday night about Bill, one of the co-founders of AA. And today I want to talk about the other co-founder, Dr. Bob. I want to talk about God's search and rescue mission for Dr. Bob. Remember, we're all allowed to have our own concept of God. Here's mine. God created the world in 6 days, took a day off to rest, and then instead of spending the rest of eternity watching Netflix, he decided he'd spend a good amount of his time launching search and rescue programs for addicts. So here's the story of one of God's most successful search and rescue missions. The story of Dr. Bob, one of the co-founders of AA, the other, of course, being Bill Wilson. So Dr. Bob's story comes right after the chapter of Vision for You in the Big Book. So if you have a Big Book, we're on page 171. And before we talk about how God rescued Dr. Bob, let's get some background on him. He starts out by saying, I was born in a small New England village of about 7,000 souls. And he goes on to say everything was fine. His parents were fine. The town was fine. They were moral, good. He had this great childhood. So his parents were great, and he became an addict anyway. And I think this is really important because a lot of us say, well, the reason I'm a compulsive eater is because dot, dot, dot. And then we usually blame someone, and that someone or that those someones are usually our parents. But in the story, Freedom from Bondage, on page 544, the author says she didn't become an alcoholic because of what happened to her in her childhood. She said, I am the result of the way I reacted to what happened to me as a child. So again, it's always on us. Are we going to forgive or are we going to spend our life blaming people? Because ultimately, the fact that I'm an addict has nothing to do with how I was raised. It has to do with the way I live my life. And Dr. Bob makes that clear, continues on page 172, and he says, I was the only child, which perhaps engendered the selfishness, which played an important part in bringing on my alcoholism. Okay, so if we only have one child, let us not just run and grab our spouse to, make another baby so that we won't mess up our own child. We shouldn't say, oh my gosh, that's setting the stage for them to be addicts. Because Dr. Bob isn't emphasizing the only child part. He says it's the selfishness part. And later on, he really digs in and defines it. He says, my whole life seemed to be centered around doing what I wanted to do without regard for the rights, wishes, or privileges of anyone else, a state of mind which became more predominant as the year passed. That's interesting. We always talk about the illness as being progressive, but we usually think of it in terms of food, right? Our binges get worse and worse. But he's talking about even before the binging, his selfishness and self-centeredness got worse and worse progressively. Well, that makes sense, right? Page 62 of our text says selfishness and self-centeredness. That we think is the root of our troubles. So Dr. Bob was perfectly right to say selfishness and self-centeredness is the root. I actually drew a little picture of a tree in my big book, and I drew roots under the tree, and I wrote the words selfish and self-centered by the roots. The thing about roots, though, is you don't see them, right? We can be very good at hiding our selfishness and self-centeredness. But on a tree, we see the fruit. So I drew three little circles like apples, and one a big R for resentment, another a big F for fear, and in the last one, a big H for harms. Those are the fruits of this illness. So here's Dr. Bob saying he was selfish and self-centered, and you can even see it by the example he gave. He said, my parents made me go to church, and basically, I'll show them. I decided when I was old enough, I would never go to church. Interesting, right? Turns us back on God. But he makes an exception. Says, I'll never go to church, except when circumstances make it seem unwise to absent myself. So basically, he was like using church, right? Oh, I'll go to church if someone will be mad at me for not going, or I'll go if, it's to impress someone that I'm there. He used God, he used church in a self-centered, self-serving way. So it made me think, do we use religion that way? Do we use God? Do we ignore God except when we want to treat him like a genie in the bottle? Like, God, things aren't working out too well. Please come out of your bottle, give me my three wishes. And if you do, thanks and go back in your bottle. I'll call you when I need you. And if you don't, well, then I'll just ignore you even more and maybe even say you don't exist. Never worked for me, didn't work for Dr. Bob. So Dr. Bob continues talking about the progression of his selfishness. And he says through college, through medical school, he was drinking. And something I noticed when I read this story, page 174, it says his father, when he was in college, made a long journey in the vain endeavor to get him straightened out, but it had little effect. Dr. Bob had a father who really loved him and who may have died before Dr. Bob ever got sober. But he loved him, and Dr. Bob felt it. Twice he mentioned his father's attempt to help him. And it made me think of times we might do things for people out of love and never see the result, right? Imagine if Dr. Bob's dad had said, I'm not going to try and help my bum son again. I'm not seeing any results here. Maybe none of us would be here. But he still tried. And what that teaches me is that I need to love even when it's difficult and even when I don't see results. So Bob becomes Dr. Bob, bottom of page 174. Every mother's dream, right? My son, the doctor. But he says, by this time I was beginning to pay very dearly physically, and in hope of relief, voluntarily incarcerated myself at least a dozen times in one of the local sanitariums. Okay, this is a guy who wanted to get better. I mean, 6 times. He's a doctor, so people knew him. But he said, I need to be locked up because I can't stop. So he had a desire to stop. But remember, desire alone won't do it. Page 24 says that at a certain point in the drinking of every abnormal drinker, he passes into a state where the most powerful desire to stop is of absolutely no avail. That was my story, right? I had a desire to stop, didn't have the power. So when the obsession struck for Dr. Bob, he did what any good addict would do. He got his friends to smuggle alcohol into the rehab for him, or he'd steal the alcohol in the building. So he got worse. He's in rehab, actually getting worse. And that was me for my first 7 years in OA, right? I went to meetings. I had like 50 different sponsors. I did the work they told me, but I got progressively worse. I went from binging and purging twice a week to throwing up to 6 times a day and needing major surgery on my esophagus. Like Dr. Bob, I had the desire and I did a bunch of work. But I was like someone with diabetes who just went to Diabetes Anonymous meetings without ever being taught how to inject insulin. I got worse, so did Dr. Bob. I mean, if we want it, we're going to get it. Or a better way to say it, if the illness demands that we have it, we're going to find a way to get it. I heard a woman say once that she, like Dr. Bob, locked herself up in rehab, her for compulsive eating, and then she sent herself a candygram. Unless we are safe and protected by God, we have no choice when it comes to food. So here's Dr. Bob not getting better. And again, his dad tries to help him. His dad sends a doctor out from his hometown. And he's okay for a bit, but then prohibition starts. That means alcohol was illegal all over the United States. So he says, well, I'll get drunk now because in a month when prohibition starts, then I'll get sober. But of course, there were bootleggers, people who brought in alcohol illegally, and he was able to get it anyway. But it reminds me of when I'd been guilty of the I'll start tomorrow syndrome, right? So here's Dr. Bob. I'll start when prohibition starts. For me, it was I'll start tomorrow or Monday or the first of the month or the first of the year. I'll start tomorrow. What that really is me thinking my cure is my pillow. That if I put my head on it for 7 hours, I'm suddenly going to have the power that I didn't have before. That would be a true miracle pillow. 7 hours with your head on it, cured. But of course, didn't work for Dr. Bob, and unfortunately, my pillow is a plain old pillow. So here he is. He goes on drinking, passing out at home, going to work, just so he could be at the hospital long enough to keep his job and earn money to drink. He kept this up for 17 years. You imagine 17 years? That's like you have a baby and then they're graduating from high school. That's how long, 17 years. And he said during this time on page 177, I used to promise my wife, my friends, my children that I would drink no more. Promises which seldom kept me sober even through the day, though I was very sincere when I made them. Again, he was sincere. He had a desire, but desire doesn't do it. Imagine someone with cancer going to their wife, their friends, their children, and saying, I promise I'll make my cancer cells stop multiplying. It would be heartbreaking because we would know that person had zero power to make their cancer cells stop multiplying. And Dr. Bob had zero power to make himself stop drinking. And I had zero power to make myself stop binging. So he went on like this. Page 178, he talks about a group of people he found, and he says, they attracted me because of their seeming poise, health, and happiness. So this was the Oxford group. This was a Christian spiritual group that just helped people with different problems. So he was attracted by their poise. Poise is a self-confidence, but not based on pride, based on confidence that God's got my back, that God's taking care of me, so I can be comfortable in any situation. So that's what these people had. And he said they had great freedom from embarrassment. They were at ease on all occasions and appeared healthy, but most of all, they seemed happy. So again, that's a trait that we should automatically get in recovery. And for sure, we should project it, that people don't look at us and say, oh my gosh, I know she's in recovery, but she looks so sad. Like all she does is help others and she doesn't even have time to wash her hair. We are supposed to exude happiness, joy, and freedom. That's a promise of this program. So here's Dr. Bob. He's no dummy. He looks at himself and sees that he's ill at ease. His health was at the breaking point, and he is thoroughly miserable. He said, I sensed these people had something I didn't have from which I might profit. And I learned it was something of a spiritual nature, which didn't appeal to me very much. So he was honest, like, okay, I see they're happy, healthy, poised, and it's the result of some spiritual work, and I don't like it. But he said, I thought it could do no harm. So I gave the matter time and study for 2.5 years, but still got drunk every night. And isn't that like a lot of us? I mean, I remember reading program literature while I was binging. It was like if I had cancer and I'm reading a manual on how chemotherapy works, but if I'm not getting hooked up to the chemo machine or however they do it, I'm not going to get better. And that was Dr. Bob reading, but not getting better. And in a lovely testimony to his wife, he says on page 178, how my wife kept her faith and courage during all those years, I'll never know, but she did. If she had not, I know I would have been dead a long time ago. His wife had courage and she had faith. The word courage always makes me think of the Wizard of Oz and the Cowardly Lion, right? What did that lion do? He continued on to Oz, even though he had fear. And he had friends who propped him up when things got difficult. So in recovery, when things are rough and we need courage, when we need to keep going, even when it's scary and hard, like hopefully we have friends, we have this fellowship, so where we can prop each other up along the yellow brick road. Okay, I know that's corny, but I thought it sounded cool. So Dr. Bob also says his wife's faith kept him alive. Well, how come? How could one person's faith help keep another person alive? Because faith actually does something in the spiritual world. Faith is currency in the spiritual world. It leads us to communicate with God. And maybe it was her faith and her whispered prayers that led God to say, my next search and rescue mission will be for her husband. Or maybe it was because at that point, Dr. Bob said at one of the Oxford group meetings held at the house of Henrietta Seiberling, remember that name, comes up again. She was on God's search and rescue team for sure. At Henrietta's house, Dr. Bob said, guys, or if it was in the South, he would have said, y'all, I have this confession to make. I'm an alcoholic. And, I can just picture them maybe chuckling behind their hands a little bit. Like, okay, Bob, tell us something we don't already know. They all knew he was an alcoholic. And Henrietta said, we will pray for you. And there they were praying for him. So imagine like their faith and prayers and Dr. Bob's wife's faith and prayers. And what was the result? Well, we'll flip back a couple pages and see the result of all that prayer and all that faith. In the chapter of Vision for You, page 155, we find our other co-founder, Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson didn't live anywhere near Bob, but he just happened to be there on a business trip that went very badly. He was newly sober. The business deal had gone down the tubes. He was not in good health. He had no money and he was physically weak. And he said, I better do something. So he went to a payphone and there was a list of 6 churches. And he said, I need to find like a priest or a minister who's going to give me a drunk to try to help. He said, that's what I need to do. And he called all 6. And not until the very last one did he get a pastor who said, I'll get you in touch with this woman who has a spiritual group at her house. Maybe she can help. So Bill Wilson calls, you guessed it, Henrietta Seiberling. And when she answers the phone, he says, my name is Bill. I'm in town for business. I'm newly sober. Do you know a drunk who I can help? And she simply said, we've been expecting you. We've been expecting you. She knew her prayers were going to work. So it wasn't like, oh my goodness, I can't believe God answered my prayers. It was like, we prayed for help for Bob. We didn't know how it would come, but we knew that it would come. Because God isn't limited by how we think things will happen. She might have thought he was going to get sober in the Oxford group, but she said, we've been expecting you. So what happened? She invited Bill over. She called Dr. Bob's wife and said, can you bring Bob over here tomorrow to talk to this guy? And Bob said to his wife, fine, but I'm not going for more than 15 minutes. So I actually did a little research in the book AA Comes of Age about that first meeting, how Bill prepared for that meeting. Bill talked to Dr. Silkworth, the author of the doctor's opinion, before he left Akron, because he said he was trying to help people and they weren't getting better. So they were talking strategy. And Dr. Silkworth says, just tell your story. Just talk about what you were like, basically what happened, God happened, and what you're like now. I find that fascinating. Basically, Dr. Silkworth said, the first thing we have to do is help someone to see that they're powerless by forming an identification, help them see they're powerless. And maybe that's why for me, going to a therapist never worked. Going the religious route never helped me stop binging. Now, again, big fan of therapy if it's the right therapist. Go to church every week. But that's not what helped me to stop binging. What Dr. Silkworth told him is basically, you have to take a first step. You have to admit you're powerless and your life is a total train wreck, ego deflation at great depths. And that's what had to be done. So Bill went in there and instead of getting all spiritual and telling him how great the Oxford group was, he shared stories about how he used to drink and how he would say, I'm just going to have one, but would keep drinking until he pretty much lost everything. So he's telling Bob this, and I'm sure Dr. Bob was saying things like, yeah, I drink like that too. Yeah, I did that too. So he went in there he was saying he would only stay for 15 minutes, and he ended up saying 15 minutes plus 6 hours. So that's something about Bill. He was willing to put in the time, and Dr. Bob was willing, but not willing enough just yet. On page 155, it says, a spiritual experience, he conceded, was absolutely necessary, but the price seemed high upon the basis suggested. Why, he argued, should he foolishly admit his problem to his clients? He would do anything, he said, but that. And as we'll see, his but that and our but that's always end up with trouble. So Bill stayed with Dr. Bob for 3 weeks, kept working with him. Bob stopped drinking, and then he went to a medical conference and he got drunk again. And I find it really fascinating what happened next. Dr. Bob gets drunk at the conference, drunk on the way home, and then wakes up drunk at a friend's house, not knowing how he got there. The friend called his wife, who called Bill, and what did Bill do? Did he say, I spent 3 weeks of my life working with you so that you would get better? How dare you do this for me? Or I told you you shouldn't go away with so little time under your belt. I'm on the next train back to New York. Or, I've worked with you. You need now to hear another voice. Goodbye and good luck. He did not do that. Here's what Dr. Bob said Bill did. He came and got me home and to bed. He took him home. He put him to bed. Think about putting a drunk alcoholic to bed. Bob probably smelled. Bill probably took his shoes off his dirty feet and covered him with a blanket. And Bill stayed with him. And there's an interesting line on page 180. It says he stayed with him and then he gave him 1 glass of beer the next day. So I'm thinking, why on earth did he give him a glass of beer the next day? Like we don't hand someone a Hershey bar, their first day. So the reason is Dr. Bob was scheduled to do a surgery that only he could do a couple days after he got back from, the medical conference gone bad. And he was shaking so badly that Bill gave him 1 glass of beer to steady his hand so that he could perform the surgery. So this is not to say, again, that we give someone 1 Hershey bar the next day. We don't do that. This was for a very specific person, for a very specific reason, so his hand wouldn't shake. He did the surgery, which was successful, and Dr. Bob never drank again because immediately after that surgery, he went around town and he told all the people he didn't want to tell that he was an alcoholic. So his I'll do anything but that became I'll do anything, period. And we know that's critical, right? Page 58 tells us if you have decided you want what we have, what do we have? A spiritual experience as a result of these steps, and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then, and I say then and only then, are we ready to take certain steps. So Dr. Bob became willing and never drank again. And he spends the last couple of pages in his story talking about his recovery, and he gives us many pearls of wisdom. He says, you may be asking, what did that man, Bill, do or say that was different from what others had said or done? Because, we can assume he's read the Bible, he's read spiritual literature, he was around spiritual people, he was a doctor, so I'm sure he read medical literature. First, he says, Bill gave him correct information. And I would say correct information with love. Bob wasn't a project to Bill. He loved him. There's love if you're going to spend all that time and then take a drunk man home, take his shoes off, and stay with him. Love and good information. And Dr. Bob says, of far more importance was the fact that he was the first living human with whom I had ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regard to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. And that goes along with what it says in the foreword to the 3rd edition. Recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another alcoholic, sharing experience, strength, and hope. Why does it say that? Why don't they say that recovery begins when I take a certain step, when I take step 1? I think it's because when one addict talks to another, something happens. There's more than a conveying of information. There's a transmission. Bill Wilson was transmitting something to Dr. Bob. I looked up the definition of transmission. It says something like light, heat, sound, electricity, or other energy passes through a medium, kind of like telephones transmitting sound waves. And I think that in God's search and rescue for Dr. Bob, God used Bill Wilson to transmit God's own love and concern for Bob through Bill. If we go back to page 164, the end of the chapter, A Vision for You, it talks about this kind of transmission. It says, you cannot transmit something you haven't got. So see to it that your relationship with Him, with God, is right, and great events will come to pass for you and countless others. See to it that your relationship with God is right. That's the condition. Well, what does that mean? Well, remember when Bill Wilson first got sober and was in the hospital, he said, the thought came to me that there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who might be glad to have what had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. They, in turn, could help others. But before Bill could be fit for this work, he had to see to it that his relationship with God was right. How did he do that? Well, how do we all do that? Page 164 sums it up. Abandon yourself to God as you understand Him, right? Or step 3 basically means give God a blank check with our lives. Admit your faults to Him. Okay, that's hard. And to your fellows, that's even harder sometimes, right? Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find. And when we do that, we can join them. Bill did that. He made those 6 calls. He didn't just make 2 and say, I give up, I've tried. Then he went over to this strange woman, Henrietta's house. And even before he goes, he calls Dr. Silkworth to brainstorm on the best way to help this guy who he's never met. Then he spends over 6 hours with him, right? That's like going lunchtime and staying all the way to dinner. Put it in food terms for us. Then he stays in town for 3 weeks to help this guy. Then when he finally thinks he's helped him, Dr. Bob probably breaks his heart by coming home drunk. But he kept at it with Dr. Bob, and thank God, because if he hadn't, none of us, we might not be here today. Every now and then, by the way, someone will say something bad about Bill Wilson, like, oh, he did this thing or that thing that wasn't right. And what I say, first of all, I don't know what he did or didn't do, and it's none of my business. But more important, look what Bill did for me, for you, for us. That's what I think of when I think of Bill Wilson. So page 180, Dr. Bob is saying, it's the most wonderful blessing to be relieved of the terrible curse with which I was afflicted. He says he's regained his health, his self-respect, and his home life is ideal. Then he says he spends a great deal of time passing this on to others who want and need it badly. And he does it for 4 reasons. 1, a sense of duty. 2, it's a pleasure. 3, in doing so, he's paying his debt to the person who carried the message to him. And finally, as an insurance policy against drinking again. First, it's a duty because the truth, right? If we're honest, we'll all admit it. We don't always want to pick up that phone. We don't always want to like turn off the TV and take the time. I know God isn't 100% finished with me yet. I'm still selfish sometimes. So some days I do it out of duty, but often, and more often as time goes by, it's for the second reason. It's a pleasure. I think the more we grow spiritually, the more what we have to do and what we want to do become the same. Then his third reason, because in doing so, I'm paying my debt to the man who took time to pass it on to me. That's just gratitude in action. And I have to tell you, when I hear my sponsees sponsoring someone or speaking at a meeting about how God removed their food obsession, it makes me really, really happy. And finally, he says, every time I do it, I take out a little more insurance for myself against a possible slip. It's our best insurance policy, right? First line of chapter 7 says, nothing will so much ensure immunity against alcoholism or compulsive eating as intensive work with other alcoholics or compulsive eaters. Intensive work. You know, Dr. Bob continues by saying he used to get upset when he saw his friends drink, but realized he couldn't. So he schooled himself to believe that though he once had the same privilege, he abused it so frightfully it was withdrawn. So we can do that. We can say to ourselves, like, self, I used to have this privilege to be able to eat whatever, but I abuse this privilege and now I don't have it anymore. Just like if you get too many DUIs, your privilege to have a driver's license is withdrawn. And then Dr. Bob starts talking some tough love. He says, if you think you're an atheist, an agnostic, a skeptic, or have any other form of intellectual pride which keeps you from accepting what's in this book, I feel sorry for you. It's interesting he calls atheism, agnosticism, and skepticism forms of pride because that's really me thinking I can do it on my own. And remember, he doesn't say if you are an atheist, agnostic, a skeptic. He says if you think you're an atheist, agnostic, or skeptic, meaning you may think you are, but you're not. And like, I guess it would be like me thinking and saying, I have no lungs inside of myself. I could think it, right? This is America. I'm free to think and say what I want. So I could say, I'm a lung atheist. I don't believe I have lungs. But of course, what I think about my lack of lungs doesn't matter, right? And our book tells us, page 55, that deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. So that between those two lungs that God gave me, God planted the fundamental idea of himself. And the next line says, this fundamental idea of God inside of us may be obscured, but it's there. And I could talk about this forever, my favorite topic. But we have podcasts on the chapter We Agnostics about finding God, even when it's difficult. But for now, just to suffice it to say, Dr. Bob basically says, you may think you're an agnostic, but you're not. And it's like an invitation. Don't have so much pride that you block yourself off from the sunlight of the Spirit. And Dr. Bob continues on with his tough love. If you think you're strong enough to do it your way, that's your affair. Like, we're not going to try to convince you that you really need this. But if you really want to quit for good and all, not just to look good for our high school reunion so that boy who dumped us when we were 17, we all have that, right? Feels bad. It's like if you want to quit for good and all and feel you need help, he says, we know we have an answer for you. And then here's his conditional promise. It never fails. So never, like 0% of the time it fails. But here's the condition. It never fails if you go about it with half the zeal you've been in the habit of showing when you were getting another drink. I put a lot of zeal into getting my binge foods. I stole food. I stole money for food. I walked the streets of New York City at 2 in the morning with my rent money. Today, I have to put that kind of zeal into my recovery. And if we do this work, we are promised it will never fail. And on the last line, he tells us why it will never fail. Because our Heavenly Father will never let us down. God will never let us down. So to sum up, I believe we are all here because God has launched a search and rescue mission for every single one of us. And he's given us a manual and people to help us so that we can recover and then join him on his search and rescue mission for others, the way that Bill joined and rescued Bob. Like, what a glorious and beautiful sense of purpose for all of us. And what a glorious God to give that to all of us. And that is all I have.